Hello everyone, my name is Peter. Data annotation has always been a problem for AI engineers. In the last video, we have discussed what you need to consider when facing the decision between in-house and outsource. So if you choose to outsource, the next question is, how would you negotiate a contract with a vendor? Today, I'm going to walk you through some of the key points you need to consider when negotiating a contract with a vendor, and hopefully help you to find the best vendor for your project. Before I get into the details of contracting negotiation, I want to quickly mention that when you have decided to outsource, there are two types of vendors you can choose from. The first type of vendor is crowdsourcing vendor. Although I call them vendors, but in fact, they're just individuals that spread across the world. You can access them through platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk or AmTurk, and all you need to do is just post the instructions and the set price for each task. For this type of vendor, the advantage is you can access them whenever you want to. You don't have to negotiate a contract with them. However, the disadvantage is when you try to communicate the instructions, it's going to be difficult to communicate with many people. Plus, there's no centralized quality assurance control, which means you have to do the QA yourself. The second type of vendor is specialized data annotation companies. Those are companies dedicated just to data annotation projects. For this type of vendor, it's going to be easier to do instruction communication because you only have to talk with the project manager who then will educate the labelers. It is also going to be easier to do quality assurance because those companies should have quality assurance processes within the company. So my suggestion is, if your task is easy, such as telling the difference between a cat or a dog, you should use crowdsourcing vendor because there's not too much instruction to be communicated. Whereas if your task is complicated, for example, involving some level of subjective judgments, you should use specialist vendor. Now back to our discussion about contract negotiation. There are two types of pricing model you can choose from, pay by label or pay by headcount. Pay by label means there's going to be a unit price for each label. This price could go from a few cents to several dollars. And your total price is going to be this unit price times the number of labels in your project. Whereas pay by headcount means there's going to be a unit price for each headcount. A headcount is a person will dedicate to this project at a capacity of 8 hours a day, 22 days a month, and your total price is going to be the number of headcount you used times the hourly rate or daily rate. Now you've learned there are two types of pricing models. The next question is, which one fits your project better? I think there are three measurements you have to consider when making this decision. These are data volume, quality of work, and the trust of your vendor. For the rest of the video, I'm going to analyze each of the measurements and give you some guidelines on each of them. The first measurement is data volume. Here I have come up with three types of data volume, and I think your data volume should be able to fit into one of these three types. The first type is spiky type. This happens quite often for startup companies or early stage project in a corporate where you don't have a steady inflow of data yet. Here I have made a chart that compares spendings for both pricing models and your data volume. As you can see, the blue area is your data volume across a 24 months period of time. The dotted line is the spending based on pay by label model, whereas the red line represents the pay by headcount model. In this spiky data volume case, I want you to notice two things. The first thing is that the dotted line is always higher than the red line, which means for any given data volume in a month, pay by label should always be more expensive than pay by headcount. This is because pay by headcount often comes with a commitment thresholds, say 3 months or 6 months. This allows the vendor to better control their cost, and the cost savings should be passed on to the client side. Therefore, it will be cheaper for you. The second thing you should notice is when your project data volume drops, the cost for pay by label model will instantly drop, whereas the cost for pay by headcount model will stay at an unnecessarily high level for a period of time. This is mostly due to the thresholds I just mentioned. So by looking at this chart, I would suggest that if your data volume is not very steady, it is more economical to use the pay by label model, mostly because you don't have to incur the extra cost when your data volume drops. The second type of data volume is the steady type. This is often seen in large AI companies or self-driving companies more specifically. As you can see from the chart, using the pay by headcount model will be more appealing since the red line always lies below the dotted line. Why this is the case? Like I just mentioned, Assuming that you could commit to a minimum time threshold, the vendor would be able to offer a much cheaper price. The last type of data volume is the mixed type, which is often seen in medium to large AI companies. Based on my own experience, this happens to most of the companies I've ever seen. As you can see, the two lines are intersecting each other. The only part you should pay attention to is from month 16 to month 19. The problem here is that if you use the pay by label model, which is the dotted line, most likely you're going to overpay. However, if you use the pay by headcount model, which is the red line, starting from month 16, your data volume is going to exceed the capacity. You might be wondering, why can't I give a vendor an early notice and ramp up the capacity ahead of time? This is often pretty hard to do, given that sometimes you may not have 100% control on the timing of your data inflow. For example, the data could come from your client or other departments within your company. In this case, your best strategy is to use a combined approach, which means you should be using a pay by headcount model during most of the time. Meanwhile, when there's extra data coming in, you should temporarily use the pay by label model before ramping up capacity with the vendor. Now let's move on to the second measurement, quality of work. Talking about this, it is really hard to argue which pricing model will definitely incentivize a higher quality. That said, if your project is very complicated and it takes a long time to learn, I would prefer using the pay by headcount model than the pay by label model, simply because you want to make sure that your vendor are using the same group of people on your project in the long run. Now let's move on to the third measurement, trust of your vendor. When you're using the pay by headcount model, you might be wondering, is the vendor actually putting on their promised number of people onto my project? I would say this is a fair question to have since you don't see them on a daily basis and they might be working on the other side of the world. In this case, what you should do is first have someone on your team to test the daily output before talking to the vendor. And second, when you are negotiating the contract, you should be putting down a minimal output level on the contract to make sure that they are fully committed. Now let's have a recap. After making the decision to outsource, the next question is, how do I negotiate a contract? There are two types of a pricing model to choose from, pay by label and pay by headcount. Each option has its own merit. It all depends on your situation. We then break down the situation into three measurements. The first one is data volume, which could then be divided into spiky, steady, and mixed. I've given you the best strategy for each type. Other than data volume, there's also quality of work and the trust of your vendor to be considered. So that was everything for this episode. Hopefully, after watching this video, you will have a much better idea on how to negotiate a deal with the annotation vendor. If you want to know more about data annotation, please leave your comments. I will try my best to answer them. You could also visit the website below to get more information. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends.